Okay, so the specific topics we're going to cover today, we're just going to start with an introduction to governance. Then we'll talk about how to manage resources using an enterprise agreement for those of you who are licensing Azure in that way. We'll talk about the importance of organizing subscription resources and methods you can use to do that. We'll also talk about role-based access control, resource manager policies, locks, security and auditing, as well as, Javier, let's see if you might be able to mute yourself there, if you would. A little bit of background noise there. Yep, so we'll talk about locks, security and auditing, and we'll discuss a few best practices as well. So we'll start off with an introduction to governance. So I'd be the first to admit that governance is not necessarily a sexy topic, but it's a very important topic, especially in the enterprise, as I mentioned. I think one of the chief fears or things that prevent organizations from moving toward the cloud is the fear that they'll lose control. They've established controls in their enterprise on-premise, and they're concerned, will I be able to have that same level of control when I have workloads deployed in the cloud? Well, specifically, we're going to talk about ways to control subscriptions. So it would be possible to kind of have subscription sprawl, if you will. We'll talk about ways to prevent that as well as ways to track costs within your subscriptions. Another important thing we'll discuss is implementing a least privileged model of access in Azure. Definitely we have the capabilities to do that in Azure, and we'll dig into that topic. We'll talk about preventing accidental resource deletions as well. Another real key feature that we'll need to cover is a topic called resource manager policies. This is going to enable us to minimize costs as well as just prevent unsupported services from being deployed in our subscription. We'll talk about how you can monitor resources for outage. We'll look at the activity log, sort of the audit log within Azure. And also we'll discuss the capabilities to minimize errors and increase an organization's agility by using automation. So we have all these features available in Azure, and we're going to dig into those. So what are the tools for governance in Azure? Specifically, we have the Azure EA portal. Now this is relevant if you are an organization that has licensed Azure with an enterprise agreement. And we'll talk about the ways that the enterprise, the EA portal helps you. We'll discuss Azure Active Directory and how it is the authentication and access management solution for Azure, as well as all of Microsoft's cloud properties actually. We'll discuss resource groups, what they are, what they're for. We'll talk about policies, again, giving us control over what can be deployed in our subscriptions. Again, we'll discuss role-based access control, which is the feature that enables just granting the permissions that are required. We'll also talk about a feature called resource locks that can help prevent accidental deletions. We'll discuss, we actually, in this training today, we won't really get into Security Center, Key Vault, nor OMS. Those are additional levers we can pull within Azure to increase our governance capabilities, but those are topics we won't touch on really today. And we'll discuss today templates as well as managing via command line. So let's start with the Enterprise Agreement portal, the Azure EA portal. So the Azure EA portal is really for organizing and managing subscriptions. It is a common occurrence within a larger enterprise to deploy more than one subscription. In fact, it's common that you would be deploying maybe a subscription per business unit, sometimes more than one subscription per business unit. So this creates some management challenges, as you would expect, and the EA portal really helps us to manage that. The EA portal enables us to define a structure within the portal for our business units. They're called departments within the EA portal. And we can really build out a hierarchy of departments just really that matches the organization. And subscriptions can be created within those departments, And then we can also establish administrators who can manage those subscription resources and can also track their spending because quotas can be established as well within the Azure EA portal. Now the quotas are soft quotas, so they are not going to actually stop spending at a certain level, but it gives a department administrator something to track toward in terms of trying to meet their quota. And of course, we can also roll up all of the usage and costs for all of the subscriptions associated with that, that enterprise agreement. Now, some of the roles that are relevant here, we'll talk about the first two on the left. These are relevant for the enterprise portal, the enterprise, the EA, Azure portal, I should say. First, there is the concept of an enterprise admin. This is the top-level management account. This person has really full rights within that EA Azure portal, and they're able to create departments, they're able to create subscriptions, they can associate individual users or groups with departments so that we can set up management or distributed management of subscription resources. Then we have the department admin. So if I am an enterprise admin, maybe I create an HR department within my EA portal, I can then grant a user or a group the rights to manage that department, which would then enable them to track their costs, to manage resources just within that department, and so forth. So these are the rights we'll talk about within that enterprise portal. Now the two roles, if you will, to the far right, these are really more relevant to all Azure subscriptions. The account owner role is the all-up owner of a subscription when it is first created. This person is going to be able to control who is the service admin and any co-administrators for a subscription. Of course, they can do usage data, and by default, this person will be the service admin as well. So the service admin, the last one we'll talk about, is the person that has full rights within the Azure subscription to create resources, to grant rights to other users, and so on. But this person does not have any right, access into the Azure EA portal. Now, there are various ways you can set up your EA portal. These are just 3 examples. You kind of need to choose the methodology that best fits your organization. So you see here we have a functional model. We also have a business division model where we've broken up departments by the business divisions. And in some cases, a geographic model might be best because maybe your organization spans many different geographic areas. So another thing to consider whenever you're deploying multiple subscriptions associated with an enterprise agreement is that you're going to need to figure out a way to connect resources in those different subscriptions. And there are a few different ways that we can do that. Things like ExpressRoute, virtual network peering, which is going to be able to connect virtual networks that are in the same Azure region. We can also use site-to-site VPNs, so several ways to establish that connectivity. We'll talk about kind of why that's needed in the next slide. See a couple of questions about access to the slides. I'm actually not sure whether or not the slides are being provided. Javier, do you know if the slides are being provided? Javier may have stepped away. We'll find out. We'll get an answer to you guys who are asking that question. Okay, so why, again, I mentioned having multiple subscriptions, multiple virtual networks. Why would an organization be in that situation in the first place? Well, if you notice in the diagram here, I have a marketing, an IT, and an HR department. In this case, we have subscriptions provided for each of these. This is a very common thing in the enterprise. The problem, though, is that the virtual networks that are represented by the dashed lines in each of the different departments, those represent virtual networks, and a virtual network is an isolation boundary. So we really need some way to, probably we need some way to connect these virtual networks. And so definitely important to understand kind of the why around that. And again, the ways we can do that, we can connect virtual networks using virtual network peering. Again, if the networks are in the same Azure region. We can also use things like ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPN connections. So let's move on to the topic of organizing resources within your subscription. So the first thing we want to cover really is just the question, why would we worry about organization in the first place? Now, if you used Azure in the past, when it was really, you were using really the classic portal, you were very limited in the way you could organize your resources, and that presents problems. So some of the reasons why you might want to organize resources would be resource management. It's a good idea really to contain all of your resources in one resource group that has the same life cycle in terms of management of those resources. So if you think about it, if I'm deploying, let's say, a web application in Azure, let's say that web application is going to have 2 servers that are web servers, maybe a database backend, maybe a storage account, a virtual network. It might make sense to place all of those in the same resource group because those resources really have the same lifecycle management, or management lifecycle, I should say. Another reason why it's a good idea to organize resources is for security reasons. You see, a resource group is a security boundary. And so I can create resource groups, and then I can assign rights to those resource groups. And that could be either to users or groups. And then those users or groups will be able to manage what resources are in those groups and nothing more. And so it's a way for us to control security as well. Also, a resource group is a deployment boundary. So if I'm going to be using Azure Resource Manager templates to deploy my infrastructure, the target of that deployment is going to be a resource group. Now, one other reason I'll give is just for billing purposes. You see, the resource group membership for your resources, that information bubbles up to the bill, the Azure bill. And so it can be used to segregate out costs whenever you are trying to maybe do cost notification or cost controls in the organization. So I mentioned some of the reasons why a resource group might be created. This is kind of an example here. You see that there are 4 resource groups created here on this slide. In the top center, there's a shared infrastructure resource group. So this might be a resource group where we place resources that, that multiple different business units or departments are going to use. It might make sense that the same virtual network or maybe the same storage account would be used by several different business units. But then we also have resource groups that break out applications based on the department. So we have a web application in the upper right for the procurement department, a website and a SQL server you can see there. Also in the lower part we have 2 different resource groups for the HR department. One for the HR's applications that are production and one for the HR applications that are development. And so this gives you kind of a good idea of a segregation approach of applications using resource groups. So another thing that's important to know is that we can tag resources. So this is helpful so that we can kind of attach our own naming conventions and additional nomenclature to resources in our subscription. A tag is really just a name value pair. It's pretty simple. When I define tags, I'm actually defining them in the subscription, and then they're available for me to assign to different resources within the subscription. So you can see in the diagram here that I have a single resource group, and that's the procurement resource group. And that resource group has a tag, and that is the environment tag, and the environment is production. And then it has another tag assigned, and that is a cost center tag listed out as procurement. Each Azure resource can have up to 15 tags, so a lot of different opportunity there for us to add our own additional information to resources. Now within that resource group, you can see that I have a web server and a SQL server. Each of those resources also have 2 tags, environment production, cost center procurement, and actually they each have 3 tags, I'm sorry. The third one being workload, where the web server has web and the workload for the SQL server shows as SQL. So this just gives us additional ways to not only add more information to our resources, but also to organize resources. You see, I can actually search within the subscription by tag, and I will be able to quickly see the resources that have that tag applied. This is a screenshot. I'm just going to show you a demo here in just a slide or two. But you can see in the screenshot on the left, I have a list of tags. And when I click on one of those tags, I'm going to see the resources that that tag is applied to. In this case, we're using I/O codes, maybe associated with a department. Now, I don't have to just use the portal, of course. I can use command line mechanisms to manage tags and to search for resources with tags. For example, here I have a PowerShell commandlet where I'm finding an Azure ARM resource group with the tag that has the name for name of I/O code. I can accomplish the same thing with the Azure command line interface, or CLI, using the command that you see listed here. The difference really between PowerShell and CLI is historically PowerShell was only available on the Windows platform. The CLI is a cross-platform command line capability that can be installed on Linux, Mac, really kind of any operating system you'd want to install it on. I mentioned that resource group information rolls up into your Azure bill. Well, tag information does as well. So this is a screenshot of an Azure bill that is showing virtual machine consumption time. You can see that the resource groups are exposed as well as the tags. But you can envision that if I'm trying to distribute costs between different departments in my organization, this information might be really helpful. So I can kind of tell, hey, finance department, this is what you spent over the course of the month, and HR, this is what you spent. So we're going to get into the topic of policies and role-based access control here in just a little bit. But a lot of times people ask, what is the difference really between policies and role-based access control? Well, they're really complementary solutions. Policies, or resource manager policies, they really manage what resources or configurations are available at either the subscription, the resource group, or the resource level. So if you could envision a use case here with me, imagine that my organization is just starting out with Azure, and we know there are 70 plus services available in Azure, but we really want to start off with only a few things that we support. Maybe virtual machines only, let's say. Well, using a policy, I could prevent the creation of any resource type except virtual machines. So this would be a way for me to establish a service catalog of sorts. There are many things we can do with policies, actually. We can enforce naming conventions. We can determine what SKUs or what VM sizes are available to be deployed. Many different things, actually. It's a very flexible management structure. Role-based access control is a little bit different. With RBAC, we manage which users or groups can perform what actions and on what specific resources. Now, there are 3 built-in roles that we'll talk more about: owner, contributor, and reader. But it is also possible to create custom roles. And additional roles are added for specific resource types. For an example, if I have virtual machines deployed in my subscription, there is a role that could allow a user to just maybe start or stop a VM. And that's the only thing they can do. Obviously, that role is only, or action is only relevant to that particular resource type. So we can get very granular with role-based access control. So I wanted to quickly demo for you the concept of managing my resources using tags. So you're looking at my subscription here. I've logged on and I'm just really sitting at the dashboard. So I have created a few tags in my subscription, and I want to show you those first. If I click on More Services here in the filter list on the Azure menu, and if I type in tags, this is going to filter down to this specific resource. If I click on tags, you're going to see that I have a few tags that are defined. And again, anytime I define a tag, it's really available throughout the entire subscription for me to use. So let's take a look at how tags could help you organize resources. So I'm going to click back on Microsoft Azure to get back to my dashboard. Then I'm going to click on Resource Groups. So this is going to show me all of the resource groups that are deployed in my subscription. Now, I don't have a lot of resource groups, but you could envision in a large enterprise, I might have hundreds, maybe thousands of resource groups deployed here. And so it could be quite difficult to organize my resources here. And so notice that I have a few that are very specific to departments, like HR Dev, HR Prod. I have a procurement resource here, also an IT resource. So let's look back at how tags can help us search for these resources. Actually, before I do that, let me just show you that if I click on the HR Dev resource group, then if I click on tags, you can see that there is a single tag applied to this resource group currently. That's the Department HR tag. And again, remember, a tag is really a key and a value. So let's go back to the list of our tags. So now if I click on one of these tags, like HR, you're going to see that it brings up the list of resources where this tag is applied. In this case, the Department HR is going to bring up both the Dev as well as the Prod resource groups for HR. Now, if I click on Environment Dev, apparently I didn't add the right tag, so that's fine. That's a good learning experience. So notice I don't see any resources. That's telling me that I don't have the right tag applied to that resource group. I'm going to go back to the resource group list. I'm going to click on HR Dev. I'll go to tags. We're going to add a tag. I'll choose from tags I've previously created, environment and dev, and then I'm just going to save that. So earlier I was noticing that the tags are not saving for some reason right this second. Maybe some problem with my portal, I'm not sure. But so we'll check back on that and see here in just a second if the tag has been applied and whether or not we can search based on that. I'm going to go ahead and just take a look right now, actually. Go back to tags. Yeah, it looks like it's not saving it. Yep, that's fine. If I have time at the end of the presentation, I can add the tag in PowerShell. For some reason it's not adding in the portal right now. I'm not sure why, but this just gives you a quick view of why we might use tags. Really, that's the point of the demo. So I can also click on Department IT. Now it's going to show me the resources where that tag is applied. Okay, let's move into the topic role-based access control. So again, RBAC is really about defining who can do what within the resources in our subscription, and it is again very granular. So we are going to assign these rights to users or groups, and we're going to really join a user or a group together with a role, and a role is really going to define the actions that can take place, and that is going to be assigned at a specific scope. The scope really is where we're applying the security, and there are really 3 levels of scope I can use with RBAC. I can apply security at the subscription level. I can apply it at a resource group level, and then I can apply it at specific resources. Another key important thing to know about RBAC is that the role-based access control you set at a parent level is always going to be inherited by resources under that level. What that means is if I apply role-based access control to a resource group, all of the resources in that resource group will inherit that RBAC setting. So a common question is, where do the identities come from that I'm using when I select or use role-based access control? So they're coming from Azure Active Directory. You'll notice here I have an Azure subscription to the right, and every Azure subscription is linked or points to a single Azure Active Directory tenant. And so all of the subscription resources here to the right, I'm going to be able to choose users and groups that are defined in the Azure Active Directory. I'll be able to use those security principles as I'm assigning rights in my subscription. Yep, as I mentioned, every Azure subscription is linked to one and only one Azure Active Directory tenant. That's where the users and groups are going to be coming from. So it's also important to know that when we talk about the Azure Active Directory tenant, that there is specific security or roles that are assigned to that tenant. And this is really outside of the Azure subscription. So again, look to the right and you'll see I have a Contoso directory with two different Azure subscriptions linked to it, as well as an Office 365 subscription. Well, within that Contoso directory, there are security roles that define who can change and manage things within the tenant. And these include the a global admin, which is going to have full control on the tenant. There's a billing admin, a password admin, and so forth. And I can also just grant rights to only read things in the tenant as well. Definitely important to know that if I have rights within the tenant, it does not imply necessarily that I have rights in an Azure subscription that's linked to that tenant. So we've been talking about role-based access control. So the three built-in roles are owner, contributor, and reader. So owner, as you might imagine, has full control. So an owner can not only add, delete, change resources within where that role is scoped to, but they can also change permissions. In other words, they can add additional users to have rights at that same scope. The contributor role is slightly different. It has full control on all of the resources where it is scoped. However, a contributor cannot change permissions at that scope. And then finally, there's the reader built-in role that allows people to read everything in the subscription except for secrets. And as I mentioned, I can apply roles to three different scopes, really: the subscription, a resource group, or specific resources. And this slide is just kind of describing what I just mentioned. That is the scopes that I can apply RBAC control at, again, at the subscription, resource group, or at resources, but also the fact that inheritance occurs whenever I establish RBAC. So if I grant rights at the subscription level, that is going to flow down through inheritance to the resource groups as well as the resources. I wanted to do a quick demo for you of role-based access control. And I'm going to start again here on my Azure portal, and I'm going to click on Azure Active Directory. You'll recall that every Azure subscription is going to be linked to one and only one Azure Active Directory. So if I create users here, I'm going to be able to use those users or groups whenever I establish role-based access control. So I'm going to create a new user. We'll start just by clicking on Users and Groups and All Users. So here's my list of users for this subscription. I'm going to click on New User. And we'll just call this user Tom Smith. It's going to be Tom at, notice that I've established a vanity domain or linked a vanity domain to my tenant, so steverlabs.com. So I am going to let this user remain just a user, but remember I mentioned there are roles specific to the Azure AD tenant. Here's a list of those. But this person is just going to remain a user. And I'm going to take a look at their temporary password here and copy that. And then what I'm going to do is finish the creation of the user. Okay, you can see that Tom Smith was just created. Now, I can tell you that I could log in to the Azure portal as this user, but I'm not going to be able to access anything because this user's not been granted rights into the subscription. I'm just going to show you that quickly. If I log into the portal using an incognito browser here, just going to put in Tom and I'll put in that temporary password. Of course, the first time I'm going to have to change that password. So you can see that I can log into the Azure portal, but notice that I don't see any resources. And in fact, if I was to look at the subscriptions here, you see that I do not even see a subscription listed. That's because I just don't have rights granted yet. So let's grant rights to Tom Smith. Now I'm back in the portal that has where I'm logged in with full rights here. So I'll click on a resource group, and I'm going to choose a resource group that has virtual machines deployed in it. Ops VM RMRG is an example. When I click on this resource group, you can see that there are multiple resources, but there's also two virtual machines here, Azure Linux VM1 and Azure Linux or Azure Win VM1. Let's grant rights to Azure Win VM1. So I'll click on the computer. Then I'm going to click on access control. Now we're going to add this new user. First we'll select a role. Let's give this person contributor rights. And then we'll find the user and save that. Now let's take a look back at the portal where Tom Smith is logged on, and let's log him off, and then we'll sign right back in as him. And we'll see that things change in the way we view them. Okay, so now Tom is logged on. He can see the virtual machine that he should be able to administer. He has contributor rights on that virtual machine. He'll be able to see all the menu options and so forth. Now I'll point out quickly, I'm going to just minimize this portal and come back to where I'm logged in with full rights. I'll point out that I only granted rights to this one object, the compute object. If I want Tom to have full control to manage everything associated with the VM, I'm going to need to grant rights to the different resources associated with that VM as well, like the disk, like the network interface card, the public IP address, and so on and so forth. So remember, these are leaf objects we're working with when we granted rights to just that computer. So quick demo there on role-based access control. So definitely want to encourage you, if you have a question, to please type it into the questions area, and I'll take time to address those when we're about done with our slides. So we'll talk about resource manager policies now. So resource manager policies, again, allow us to define what actions are allowed in the subscription. And of course, when we are carrying out actions in a subscription, by default they're allowed, and so if I have rights with RBAC, and so policies are going to be something that I'm going to control control what actions can be taken, generally by prohibiting or denying actions. So policies are defined first as a definition, so I will create a policy definition first, and then I will scope or apply that policy using a policy assignment. And the way I can do that, again, the scope I can use, or scopes, again, it's just like role-based access control. I can apply a policy at the subscription level, at a resource group, or at a resource level. Some of the use cases for policies, they're very, very flexible, so we could talk about use cases for quite a while, but these are just a few examples. We could do things like detailed chargeback through the use of, or forcing the use of tagging and resource group membership. We can control what services or where services can be deployed. For example, if my organization only exists in California, then maybe I only want to choose the regions that exist in California, like West US. I can control services so that they would only be able to be created there. Also, as I mentioned, I can create a service catalog, only allowing the creation of resources that my organization supports. We can enforce naming conventions, enforce the use of tags, and so on. So quite a few different use cases there that we can pursue. Let's take a look at how policies are defined. Policies are JSON definitions. So if we're creating a custom policy, we're going to be authoring that using JSON, JavaScript notation. So the way the structure of a policy is going to look is there will be really two key parts. There'll be a conditional control, and then there'll be an effect. So you can see here as an example that my control is that I'm saying if not field tags contains key cost center, then the effect is going to be to deny that creation. So this in effect is forcing the use of a tag that contains the cost center key. I have several different logical operators I can use whenever I'm defining those conditions, not and or. If I just look back at the condition quickly, you can see I'm using the not operator here. So I also have several different conditions that I can meet. Equals, like, contains key. Then I will be defining what the policy effect will be. And again, I can choose between these three: deny, audit, and append. So these are just some of the effects, giving examples. The first one to the left is denying a creation. And the one in the middle, interestingly, is going to generate an audit if the condition is met. And finally, to the right, we're using an append operation where we're appending a tag at creation for resources. Common question is, who can override policies? So a policy in a parent scope cannot be overridden in a child scope unless the user is the owner of that parent scope as well. So what I mean, just to walk you through an example, I have in this diagram a service catalog policy that is applied at the subscription level. Now remember, policies are going to be inherited just like role-based access control. So this policy will apply for everything in that subscription. So if you look at the resource group 1 level, there is a group that is the owner of that resource group, the project team AD group, but they're not an owner at the subscription level where that catalog was set. Because of that, they cannot override it. The same is true for resource group 2. quick demo on policies. This became a little bit easier quite recently because policies are available to be used in the portal. And there are some example policies that are already created. So it might prevent you from having to author a policy in the first place. So I'm clicking on a specific resource group. This is called ARM policy. When I click on it, I see all of the different menu options for this resource group. Notice under settings, there's one called policies. So if I click on policies, you can see that currently there are no policies that are assigned at this scope. And just to show you, there's actually no policies assigned at the subscription scope either. I'm going to click on the subscription that we're using. And look at policies here. Notice there are also no policies assigned at the subscription level. And so in theory, I have no policy controls that should be blocking any creations. So we're going to add a policy to this ARM policy resource group. We'll click on policies. We're just going to click on add. Now we can choose several policies that have been pre-created by the Azure product group. And I'm going to choose one here, allowed virtual machine SKUs. This would be a pretty popular policy because a lot of organizations are concerned that maybe users are going to create very large and expensive virtual machine sizes. So this would be a policy we could implement to prevent that. So I'm going to choose the allowed SKUs. And in my case, I'm going to allow the D1 V2. I'm going to also allow the, let's see here, the DS1 V2. The S means that it supports premium storage. And I'm also going to support the F1. So I've got those selected. Now I'm just going to give this a display name. And an ID. Now I can give this a description as well if I want. And then I'm going to click OK. So we see it successfully assigned this policy that was already created to this scope, which is this resource group. Now let's test out the resource group by coming back here to the overview. We see we're looking at the ARM policy resource group. What we're going to do is we're going to initiate the creation of a VM that does not meet the criteria that we set. Now we can do this several different ways, but I'm just going to click here at the New button in the upper left. And I'm going to click on Compute. I'll choose Windows Server 2016 Data Center. And I'm going to quickly walk through the creation of a VM. Okay, now I want to make sure I choose the resource group where I've applied that policy, which is ARM policy. And I'm going to click OK here. Now here's where it'll get interesting. We're going to choose a VM size that is not allowed by policy. So I'll just choose, I'm going to look for the most expensive one here. How about the DS14 V2? It's about $1,000 a month roughly. Okay, so I'm going to basically accept the settings here that are defined. Okay. Let me check on one thing here real quick. That validation should not have passed. Let me make sure I apply this policy. Yeah, that looks good. Give me one moment here. I'll try this one more time. So I've got that policy applied to the right resource group on policy. Okay, I'm going to try this one more time quickly. Again, we're going to make sure we choose the right resource group where the policy is applied. Going to choose a size that should not be allowed. This DS11 definitely should not be allowed. Let me see if this actually starts the creation. I should get a failure here. I'm not getting a failure. There we go. So I'm going to click on the failure here so that we'll see the message. I click here on failed get more details. You're going to see here it might be a little bit hard to see, but yeah, I can see here at the bottom the request was disallowed by policy right here. Yeah. Now this is something I could also find by looking in the audit log. I could look for where policy violations have occurred if I want to find those specific things. So I'm going to move on forward with a quick demo of using policies. Let's talk about locks now, preventing accidental deletion. So there are two types of locks that we can apply. There's a read-only lock, which is going to prevent changes to a resource. And then I can just use a cannot delete lock, which is only going to prevent a deletion action. So again, the purpose of these are not really security related per se, because if I have rights, I can remove a lock. The goal of it is to cause an administrator to maybe take a second look or make certain that they're deleting the right resource. This is an additional step. I'd have to remove a lock before I'm able to delete a resource. And again, the scope is just like role-based access control and just like policies. I can apply locks at the subscription, resource group, or resource level, and locks are inherited by child resources. I can audit different activities that happen in my subscription. For example, if I look back here at my subscription, if I go to more services and type in activity, I'm going to be able to pull up the activity log. And the activity log is where I can really audit all of the CRUD or creation, deletion, change types of events that happen in my subscription. And you can see that I'm seeing all of the actions by default that happened in the last 6 hours. There are many ways I can filter this data. If I want to see that audit event, by the way, I can just choose the resource group where that happened and apply that change. And I can see here this operation was starting here, the write of a new virtual machine. You can see it was disallowed by policy, but notice you can also see when it was happening and who did it. So the audit log is quite powerful as well in Azure. We'll cover a few best practices here. So the first thing is whenever you're going to connect virtual networks in different subscriptions, you're going to want to know the limits or what is available in terms of bandwidth and how many links can be created and connections can be created. So these are a couple of tables that just come right from the Azure documentation. So there are limits specific to ExpressRoute, if that's the mechanism you're using to connect virtual networks and different subscriptions. And there's also limitations around the number of virtual networks that can be connected based on the bandwidth you choose in your ExpressRoute circuit. If you're using a VPN gateway to connect your VNets, here are some of the limitations to be aware of. I'd say the key one really is that the maximum amount of bandwidth you'll have between two virtual networks connected with a site-to-site VPN, the maximum bandwidth is 200 megabits per second. So that's a limitation you definitely want to be aware of. I mentioned virtual network peering. If I have virtual networks deployed in the same region, I can set up a peering relationship. Now this connects the virtual networks using the Azure backbone. It does not require a site-to-site VPN, and the bandwidth is the same really as within a single virtual network. So it's very responsive, very low latency. More best practices here around policies and RBAC. We encourage you to set policies to control what can be done within a subscription, and then to configure role-based access control to allow which users or groups can perform specific operations. Definitely keep in mind that the owner role is that's one of the built-in roles we talked about. That owner role is going to be able to override policy, so be careful with that role. And remember that if you grant a user the ability to change users, then they could always add an owner role and take full control in a sense. So it probably makes sense to leverage the contributor role as much as possible. Another best practice around creating new subscriptions, we recommend that you automate the creation using a script. This is going to allow you to apply policies and role-based access control at subscription creation time. So there will never be a time that those policies and RBAC settings don't apply. And it's also another good idea to use a second script to create department-specific resource groups. And using this script, you can apply a policy that will append tags to resources as they are created. That way, every resource by default within, let's say, a marketing resource group will always have maybe the IO code for the marketing department applied. More subscription examples here. So definitely you want to deploy applications, or really all of the resources for an application, into resource groups so they can be managed together from an RBAC or role-based access control perspective, as well as just from all of the management that might take place for those resources. And you want to apply policy and limited permissions at that resource group level. So avoid setting permissions at the subscription level, because that always is going to flow down to all of the resources. Yep, this slide really is kind of showing an example of using policies and RBAC. You can see at the subscription level we've set up a service catalog policy. So we're defining what services can be deployed as well as supported instances, sizes, and there's only really one group at that level, and that's the enterprise IT owners. And then at each resource group level we might be applying different policies, and there's different RBAC owners or contributors set. It's a good idea really to build a library of templates that you want to use for deployments, as well as scripts, and these can always be reused in the organization. Obviously this type of automation limits or reduces errors, and it increases efficiency for the organization. And we would encourage you to check in those bits of code, the scripts or the templates that you're using, check those into source code control, and use good methodology around maintaining control over those changes that take place for those items. Another best practice here is just take advantage of the resources that are available to you. I hope that you've seen as a result of the presentation that there really are quite a few governance controls that you can put in place in Azure. Things like resource manager locks. Put locks on resources that you don't want accidentally deleted. Use auditing so you can find out what's changing in the environment, especially very high-profile resources and who is doing the operation. And consider using other tools like OMS, Security Center, and maybe even third-party tools to help you to manage and monitor the subscription. So this has been a pretty quick overview. I see we're right at the top of the hour. Pretty quick overview of governance in Azure. We could really talk about these topics at a much greater depth, but we did a quick overview of the topic of governance. We talked about using the Enterprise Agreement Azure portal for managing subscriptions. We discussed role-based access control, resource manager policies, talked about locks, security and auditing, and we covered a few best practices. So I wanted to open up the floor to any questions. Any questions at all that I could try to answer for you? Encourage you just to type your question into the questions area of the meeting here if you have any. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions being typed in, so I'm going to type in. Not sure if you guys can see the chat window. So Javier, are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah, I wanted to put in my email address if there was any questions for follow-up. Can the attendees see the chat window?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so if you have a question, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm happy to answer that or try to answer that. And I see that Kevin has one. Can you see a complete overview of all policies implemented in the various subscriptions? That's a great question. There is not a single interface where you'd be able to see all of the policies applied. That would be a great feature request. I think today the best way you could, the best approach might be to just document that. Of course, it'd be better to have a single view. I totally get where you're going with the question, and it would be a great feature, but I don't know of a way to do that today. It might be possible actually to do PowerShell or use PowerShell to do that. Just kind of thinking out loud. So I'm using PowerShell, and if I am scoped at a specific subscription, and if I get the Azure RM Resource Manager policies that are applied, I should be able to see a list actually. I'm going to try that real quick here. I'm just going to pull this over so you can see. I'm just logging into my subscription real quick here. And Javier, the question's been asked a few times about access to the slides. Will the attendees get the slides?
And the question was asked earlier, and only the web link to this presentation will be provided and will be emailed out to all attendees.
Okay, so I'm just going to run a command here, get Azure RM policy assignment, and this is going to, I think, return the different policies that have been assigned in my entire subscription. You can see I only have one here, so I have one policy that's applied. I can see the scope it is applied to. So Kevin, I think this would be the way I would approach dumping out that information. Does that answer your question, Kevin? I hope it does. Okay, another question here from Robert. Are there any good deal? Yeah, definitely, Kevin, a feature request. Although this definitely gets you, I think, the information. It might not be as pretty as you might like, but it is. It might be useful though. Another question here: are there any good guidance documents regarding organizational roles for Azure cloud computing? We're struggling with how to organize our cloud support functional areas. So there actually is a resource. I'm going to try to find it real quick here. Yeah. Yeah, I would encourage you to check out this link here. I'm going to put this in the chat window. Yeah, this is kind of just it's guidance around the best ways to think about organizing your subscription and access and so forth. So this is a pretty good read actually, to digging into the details of what is available, what kind of hierarchies you should look at applying. So yeah, pretty good data here. I would encourage you to check that out. Hope that answers the question for you, Robert. These are great questions, by the way. Any other questions that we could try to answer for you? Governance is a pretty big topic, so okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. You all have my email address. Oh, here's another one. Is there a best practice when governance spans geo-regions with varying data laws? Yeah, good question. So that's a challenging question to respond to, maybe. Kevin, maybe what I would encourage you to do is send me an email with that question, if you would. And let me try to approach that, give that a little bit of thought, and maybe send you a reply via email. There are definitely ways we can approach that. Yeah, data sovereignty, I think, is one thing that's kind of behind that question. And yeah, Azure actually takes data sovereignty into account in terms of the way it does platform level replication, and in the paired region strategy for availability. So there are definitely some answers there. Send me that email and we'll see if I can help with that. Any other questions? Okay, if not, definitely want to thank everyone for your attention. Thanks for spending an hour with us, a little bit over actually today. Hope this was helpful, hope it was valuable information, and I definitely wish you the best of luck on your cloud learning journey.